We're now going on to the next session, which is a TUC update in respect of agency workers. It's going to be delivered by Matt Craig, who's an Employment Rights Policy Officer for the TUC. Away you go, Matt. Introduce yourself.
Morning, everybody. My name's Matt Cray, and I'm an Employment Rights Policy Officer at the Trades Union Congress. And I'm working with colleagues on trade union engagement with the New Deal for Working People, which is the Labour government's programme of employment law reforms. I'll just share my screen so people can see my presentation. Okay, has that worked for you, Wayne? Can you see that?
Yeah, I can see it. Hopefully everybody else can.
I hope so, yeah. I was just going to talk a bit about the New Deal for Working People, which is the employment law reforms and their potential impact on agency workers. I think I last came along to the Supply Teacher Conference in March, where we had an initial idea about what some of the reforms might look like. So I just wanted to say a bit about what's happened since we last met. There still is a bit of uncertainty because until the Employment Rights Bill is actually published, we won't know for sure what's going to be in the bill and exactly what the new legislation is going to look like. So what's happened since we last met? Obviously, we had a Labour government elected, and they've proposed a large package of employment law reforms set out in a document called Make Work Pay, the New Deal for Working People. And I think there are something like 75 different pieces of employment law proposals, legislation, which should come into force over this next parliamentary term. And many of the reforms should impact agency workers. So since the new government was introduced, they've reaffirmed the commitment to publish an employment rights bill, which is going to be the main bit of legislation that's going to introduce a lot of these changes. We do think there'll be other bills as well, but this will be the main one that will hopefully introduce the main body of the changes. And it's expected that that employment rights bill is going to be published in early or mid-October, so any point in the next couple of weeks, really. And alongside that employment rights bill, we hope there's going to be sort of a detailed guidance document which will set out in detail sort of how the policies will operate in practice. And then we expect like a whole series of consultation documents, which will probably last between 4 to 6 weeks, where unions can feed in and say where we're happy, where we want improvements, and we expect that obviously the employers will be doing the same thing. What we think the bill might look like is a framework bill. So it will set out general powers that a Secretary of State will be able to take. So, for example, it won't be too detailed, but it might say that the Secretary of State has powers to introduce regulations to tackle 0 hours contracts, for example, and then many of the details about how that legislation will work in practice will be dealt with in secondary legislation. So there's going to be lots of consultations over the next 6 months or so, really getting into the nitty-gritty of how these policies are going to work. And then before the bill's coming in, there's been some early wins for workers. 3 key things, I think. There's been a commitment to increase the national living wage significantly next year. And importantly, the Secretary of State wrote to the Low Pay Commission and said, when you're thinking about national minimum wage increases, make sure you take into account the cost of living crisis and how that should be reflected in the national living wage. Secondly, there's been a statement that the Strikes Act of 2023 will be repealed, and the government's written to government departments and employers saying, don't use the minimum service legislation, we're going to repeal it. And this was the legislation that made it much more difficult for workers to exercise their right to strike. and it could have been used in the education sector. So it's positive that the government signalled their intent to revoke that bit of legislation as soon as possible. And then the third thing is they've also reaffirmed that agency workers can't be used to replace striking workers. So following the unions and the NASUWT's legal challenge to those regulations that were brought in by the last government, the current government's confirmed that they're going to prevent agency workers being used in that way. So TUC engagement with the Labour government. So what we've been doing over the last sort of 6-7 months is working with Labour advisors and then civil servants to sort of really thrash out the detail of what that employment legislation should look like. So we've been working really closely with our affiliated unions to develop detailed policy. So if you look at the Make Work Pay document, it's quite headline policies, headline details. So we've been really working to set out the detail behind those. And yeah, there's been lots of engagement with civil servants, lots of meetings, including with employer groups as well, to sort of try and counter some of the arguments they're putting forward to water down the Employment Rights Bill. Yeah, and unfortunately, we don't know the exact details of the Labour proposals yet, because it was the Labour government's proposals, because we're still going through that dialogue and process of trying to firm up the details. So we don't know exactly what's going to come out of the bill. We don't know exactly what the impact will be on agency workers. But we do know that there's huge potential within the bill to improve working conditions for agency workers. So I'm sorry I'm not able to share further details with you about exactly what the bill is going to look like, but we just don't know yet. So I just wanted to share a few of the key sort of headlines in the New Deal proposals and what we might expect to be included in the Employment Rights Bill. So firstly, Labour have said they'll ensure that all workers get reasonable notice of any change in shifts for working time. So what we've been calling for is that all workers, where possible, should receive 28 days notice of shifts to enable them to better plan their lives, childcare, family commitments, caring commitments, etc. But we've also said from feedback from unions that might not be possible in all sectors. So I know, for example, in the education sector, NASUWT colleagues have flagged up that it's not always possible for supply teachers to receive that degree of notice for shifts, because often you might be told with 1 or 2 days notice, for example. So we've made clear that there should be exemptions in the legislation to make sure that people don't lose out from shifts because of that. I think an important point where there's agreement across all unions is that where a shift is cancelled at short notice, then that worker should receive compensation. So if you've been told you've got a shift and then you get to the school, for example, and then you're told actually we don't need you, then there should be compensation given for that cancelled shift, and that would be lost wages, but also any other costs you've incurred, which is lost childcare costs or travel costs. So they're the points that the unions have been pushing for in relation to cancelled shifts. So some other key proposals which would hopefully bring about benefits for agency workers. The Labour government said that they're definitely going to strengthen statutory sick pay. So that would be removing the lower earning limits, making it available to all workers, and removing the waiting period, because I think currently you have to wait 3 days before you become entitled to sick pay. And then the next area is around ending one-sided flexibility and giving workers a right to a guaranteed hours contract. So this would be a new bit of legislation which would apply to agency workers or we hope will apply to agency workers and 0 hours contract workers who are on more sort of long-term insecure assignments. So the idea would be that if you'd worked for a period of 12 weeks, for example, you could say to your employer, over the last 12 weeks, I've worked an average of 30 hours per week. And then the employer, if you chose to, the employer would have to offer you a guaranteed hours contract to reflect the hours that you've worked over that 12-hour reference period. that 12-week reference period. So we know that a lot of agency workers aren't really in temporary employment, and often they will work in long-term assignments over a year or over 2 years, so they would be able to trigger a right to a guaranteed hours contract. And then I think a really significant proposal is that Labour have said they're going to establish a new labour market inspectorate called the Fair Work Agency. And this is going to be a merger of existing employment rights enforcement bodies. So it will be HMRC, National Minimum Wage Enforcement, the Gangmaster and Labour Abuse Authority, and importantly for agency workers, it will also bring in the Employment Agency Standards Inspectorate, who sort of are supposed to be the inspectors that regulate the relationship between agencies and agency workers. So it's going to merge those three bodies, and importantly, it's going to have a new independent oversight board, and they're going to invite trade unions and TUC to sit on that board to help shape the strategy of the Fair Work Agency, and make sure that it's picking up all the issues that unions are flagging are happening in the labour market. So at the moment, we don't know how many unions will sit on the board or who will be invited, but there is a firm commitment to have unions on the board. So a few of the things that unions are pushing for with that Fair Work Agency, having new powers and sanctions at their disposal. So giving the new enforcement body powers to issue harsh fines for employers who breach the law. And also an important point we're trying to raise is that inspectors should have a right to enter workplaces, to go and inspect, speak with employers, speak with workers, and find out what's going on. At the moment, a lot of agencies don't have that important power, so we want that sort of introduced for the new Fair Work Agency. Importantly, we also need to have more inspectors. The EAS doesn't have enough inspectors for the recruitment sector, so we'd like to see more there. And also talking about what new roles the Fair Work Agency could take in relation to agency workers. So hopefully the Fair Work Agency would be able to take a look at umbrella company exploitation and make sure that agency workers aren't being exploited that way, and also potential for the enforcement of agency worker regulations as well. So for equal treatment on pay and terms and conditions after 12 weeks. So just to say a little bit about the NASUWT role in developing policy. So for each of the different commitments around the New Deal, for example, 0 hours or Fair Work Agency, or unions' right to access workplaces, we've set up a working group and invited union officials along. Your union's an active participant in those groups, so we've had both legal and policy colleagues come along to those meetings. And it's really important because then the unions there are able to flag up how the reforms would actually impact the members from their unions and bring that unique insight. So the conclusions then go to the TUC Executive Committee, where senior union officials sign them off, and then that's sort of our formal approach to Labour government. So all the work's done is really democratic. We're getting a lot of feed in from unions, and it's all signed off by the sort of TUC democratic structures. And just to flag a few of the key issues that your union's been able to raise is agency mistreatment of supply teachers. For example, preventing supply teachers getting work where they've raised complaints, a lack of facility time for reps in the education sector, and the need for the reforms to make sure that they recognise the unique circumstances of supply teachers. So I've flagged up the key issue already, like getting notice at really short, getting shifts at really short notice, and making sure that any reforms don't stop supply teachers getting work as a sort of unintended consequence. So outside of the New Deal for working people, work. Just wanted to flag up another area of work that TUC's focused on, which is stopping umbrella company exploitation. There's not too much to report on this since we last met in March, but after a long union campaign, the government published proposals that could lead to the decrease in the use of umbrella companies. So I think it was last year, the Treasury, HMRC and the Department for Business of Trade launched a consultation where they set out some new proposals on how to regulate umbrella companies better. And the unions are quite positive about some of these reforms because we felt it would transfer the risk from the worker onto the recruitment agency of using umbrella companies. And we felt that if that was the case, then recruitment agencies would be less likely to use umbrellas and would sort of pay the agency workers directly, which would reduce some of the problem. So unfortunately, not a lot has happened with the regulations since they were introduced, but I think that's probably to do with the change of government and other priorities. But we're still campaigning for that new regulation to be brought in as soon as possible. And we've been trying to get hold of the Treasury and the HMRC to find out what's going on. And then a recent development is that HMRC is developing an online tool for umbrella workers to input information about their pay slips and check whether they're being unlawfully treated. So the TUC has sort of inputted into those proposals. And like one of the things we flagged up, and I think you'll be hearing about later today, is that there are other tools available which are already in use, which HMRC could learn from. So we've flagged those up. Yeah, so I just wanted to flag up some of the employer opposition to the bill. That's gradually been ratcheting up as the conversations have been developing. And as you can expect, the employer concerns are really around maintaining their ability to control the workforce as they see fit. So on day one rights to unfair dismissal, they're sort of really gearing up to oppose that because their main argument is that if someone comes into the workplace that it isn't fitting into the workplace, they still want to retain that ability to sack them within a short period of time. On flexible work, there was a proposal to make flexible working the default so that all workers would have a right to flexible working from day one in the job. Employers are very anti that, and they want to sort of control where people can work and what hours they're working. On right to switch off as well, this is another area where employers are sort of vocally opposing Labour's proposals. The right to switch off would give workers a right to disconnect from the workplace after a certain time in the day, or disconnect from technological devices to not have to be on email all the time, for example. And employers want to be able to choose when they can contact their employees, so they're quite opposed to that one. They're also raising concerns about cost and administrative burden as well. And then they're making wider points about how a whole new range of employment rights will put quite a big burden on an already stretched employment tribunal system. So a big job for unions and the TUC is to counter those arguments. And we're trying to do that with like an evidence base to show how these positive reforms will actually benefit employers as well through recruitment, retention, increased productivity. And that if there are problems with an overstretched employment tribunal system, then the answer to that is to provide additional funding for it, not to weaken the employment rights framework. So there is a big job to do countering employer opposition to the bill. And then I just wanted to finally flag up a few other interesting areas of the New Deal for working people, which might not directly relate to agency workers, but I think they're quite interesting for trade unionists. So the first is around a new right to access workplaces, which we hope will give union reps and officials a right to access an employer's premises, to speak with workers, organise them, represent them, and resolve any sort of employment rights issues they're facing. So unions are really optimistic about that at the moment, as it could be transformational and really sort of give unions the opportunity to recruit large numbers of workers and organise them and strengthen the trade union movement. And then importantly, Labour is committed to improve trade union rights and facility time. So there's been a big problem that unions reported that reps don't get enough facility time to carry out their trade union duties. So Labour have said they're going to strengthen that, and we hope that will be a change in legislation which will give union reps more facility time. And they're also going to introduce new rights for equality reps. So reps will have specific time off to deal with equality issues in the workplace. And then finally, Labour have committed to strengthening the blacklisting and union discrimination rights. So where trade unionists, reps and members are victimised and not employed or dismissed for their trade union involvement, we want to see that legislation strengthened to stop that happening in the first place, but also to really sort of punish the employers who are still involved in those shady practices. And I think that was it from me, Wayne.
Thanks, Matt. I've just got a question that's linked a little bit to one of the questions from Andrew, but I'll say my little bit first and then read Andrew's out, and then I'll make the comment that Heather made in Q&A. It's a bit about on the 12 weeks. The agency workers regulations, at the moment, I've never felt fit right for supply teachers, because to work in the same school for 12 weeks before you get rights on equal pay and things like that, or pay that you're entitled to, usually what happens then, you don't get more work in that school. And I know on the side issue, we're looking at better pay for supply teachers as when we're talking to the government from day one. So that might be a separate issue altogether. But linked to Andrew's question, how will any of these ideas work for supply teachers? I can't see how supply teachers fit into this, albeit based on his experience. It does sound very much based, and rightly so, on other areas. And again, so it's linked to my bit. I've never felt that the agency workers really fit with supply teachers. Any comments on that?
Yeah, so on the 12 weeks agency worker regulations qualifying period, I think that's definitely a fair point, and that's something that unions have flagged up to us, that obviously if you have to wait 12 weeks for agency workers who are on short-term assignments, they're never going to benefit from the equal treatment provisions around pay terms and conditions. So that is something that NASUWT flagged up to us a couple of months ago. And what we've done is given a commitment to bring the unions together and basically ask them their experiences of agency workers and say, is this a problem for your members? Would they benefit from having day one rights, which we expect the answer is yes. And then we're going to think of a way to take that forward. Unfortunately, reform of the agency worker regulations wasn't included in the New Deal for Working People, so it won't be dealt with in that employment rights bill. But that doesn't mean that's not something that the union movement can't pick up as an important campaign to improve conditions for agency workers. So that is something that we've begun to look at, and it's something that Paul from NASUWT raised with us as an important issue. So we will be looking at that. And on Andrew's point about will all of these commitments benefit supply teachers, I think that's a fair criticism of the New Deal, and unfortunately a lot of the reforms will largely benefit agency workers who've been in who are in longer term assignments, such as the right to a guaranteed hours contract. But I do think there will be some important wins for agency workers who are in shorter term assignments, particularly around shift cancellation. So even if you're on a one-day agency work assignment and your shift is cancelled, we would expect that would provide compensation to those workers and compensation for any sort of knock-on loss as well. And also, I think the Fair Work Agency, if it's done correctly, should be transformational as well, because hopefully you'll have more inspectors making sure that agency workers are treated correctly. And what we really hope will happen is that the Fair Work Agency will tackle the issues with umbrella companies, which we know are a real big problem for all agency workers, short-term and longer-term assignments. So, but I do think that the point Andrew made is right about that some of the reforms won't benefit agency workers on shorter-term assignments. I think that's a fair criticism.
Yeah. And before I fetch Paul in for the last comment on that, just a little comment from Heather. Just said, I have to pay childcare, then be able to back to work, which equates to 10% of my daily rate. So, as you said, having certain amount of paid, if cancelled at the last minute, it would be great. So, obviously, if that comes in, that's one benefit for supply teachers, which relates to another little comment Andrew made. Paul, you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Matt, for the presentation. I think it's a really good example of where we are. I mean, I think it's important to just note that it does depend on how this looks and how this is how the meat on the bone is put in. Because if you go to Matt's comment about the Fair Work Agency, there's nothing to say the Fair Work Agency won't encompass agencies as well as permanent employers. So we would have the right, and Matt will correct me if I'm wrong in veering off the reservation here, but one of the things is the right to go in to inspect workplaces. Well, what if that right then is broadened out? I could go in, or anybody could go in who represents a trade union and inspect an agency and see if the agency is appropriately operating. That could be transformational in terms of our ability to go in and say, we've heard about you, you're not doing the right thing, we want to come in and just see what's going on. The other thing to bear in mind, I think, is this is what the TUC is doing with government. The union is also engaging proactively with the Department for Education. So there is a two-pronged attack here. What Matt is talking about is the work the TUC is quite rightly undertaking in employment rights. There's nothing to say whatever comes out of discussions in the future with government, as Wayne has alluded to, may not include in the Department for Education a provision that all agency workers are paid a certain rate of pay, they can access TPS. There's nothing to say that won't also be something the union is doing on your behalf. So I think it's important to understand we're on a journey here. We started down that journey. There's a long way to go. We've got 5 years of this government, and hopefully in a few years' time, and more likely to be as we get towards the end of the government, we will be in a much better place. And hopefully that will impact on colleagues here this morning. So that was all I was going to say.
Oh, thanks for that, Matt. There was a question about sharing these slides. Will we have a copy of these to share out?
Yes, yeah. I think Kaylee's going to circulate them afterwards. So.
Yeah, and just to say that question, hopefully all the slides that we get today will be able to be shared out once we've got agreement on that from everybody. But I can't see it being an issue personally, but I don't know. I haven't spoke to everybody personally. So thanks for that, Matt.
Thanks very much. Have a good conference, everyone. Bye-bye.